camp was quiet that morning, the barbed wire glistening under a pale autumn sun. The German women walked in silence, clutching their coats tighter, expecting the usual routine of silence and orders since capture. Many of them had resigned themselves to a life where their voices no longer mattered, where even a whispered word could invite punishment. Yet, on this day, they were led not into the yard, nor into the dining hall, but into a room with long wooden tables, chairs lined neatly on both sides, and a few American guards waiting with notebooks in hand. At first, the women assumed it was some form of interrogation. Their eyes darted to the guards, anticipating stern questions, accusations, or perhaps propaganda films. Instead, one of the Americans, a sergeant with a calm voice and steady gaze, invited them to sit, then, without ceremony. He posed a question so unexpected that several women froze in disbelief. "What do you believe about the war and about your leaders?" The room stirred with nervous whispers. These women, raised under the iron discipline of Nazi Germany, had been taught that politics was not for open discussion, especially not with the enemy. Debate was dangerous. Criticism could mean prison, or worse. And here, behind barbed wire, under the control of the very men they were told were monsters, they were suddenly encouraged, not ordered, not threatened, but encouraged to speak freely. One prisoner, Helga, a nurse from Bremen, gripped the edge of the table as if it might steady her spinning mind. "Is this a trick?" she whispered to the woman beside her. Another, Anna, a former secretary, stared hard at the guard, waiting for the punchline. None came. The Americans simply waited, pens poised, patient, almost curious. It was a moment heavy with contradiction. A war still raged across Europe. German soldiers and civilians were dying daily under Allied bombing raids. Yet inside this wooden barrack in the American Midwest, German women were being told that their opinions long suppressed suddenly mattered. The silence stretched, broken only by the shuffle of boots and the creak of benches. Then, hesitantly at first, voices rose. Some defended the fatherland with fiery conviction, their words sharp and trained by years of propaganda. Others stumbled, uncertain, as if torn between fear and the strange liberation of being allowed to speak. The guards did not laugh, did not punish, did not silence. Instead, they argued back about democracy, about freedom, about rights these women had never been allowed to claim. For the first time, the German prisoners faced a reality more unsettling than captivity itself, the possibility that dialogue, not silence, might define their future. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now in your part of the world. The surprising permission to speak was not an accident of kindness, but part of a broader strategy. By 1943, the United States had taken custody of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. According to the Geneva Convention, they were required to provide food, shelter, and humane treatment. But beyond that, American authorities realized something crucial: keeping the mind engaged could be as powerful as guarding the body. The women in these camps, though fewer in number compared to male soldiers, were not exempt from this approach. For the U.S. Army, allowing political discussions inside the wire was more than a gesture of goodwill. It was a calculated move to expose prisoners to ideas long censored under the Nazi regime. Captain Robert L. Smith, one of the officers tasked with POW welfare, noted in his diary that idle silence breeds resentment, while discussion breeds thought. The camp command believed that if prisoners argued among themselves or even with their guards, their rigid ideological armor might begin to crack. Political debate, in this sense, became a weapon softer than bullets, but potentially more enduring. Life in the camps reflected this philosophy. Alongside meals that often shocked prisoners with their abundance white bread, fresh vegetables, even coffee came access to libraries, newspapers, and sometimes lectures. These privileges were not random. They were meant to highlight the contrast between democratic openness and the controlled scarcity back home. To sit in a room and be handed an American newspaper, then be asked, "What do you think?" was a quiet revolution for those raised under censorship. One striking example came from Camp Ruston in Louisiana, which housed both men and women. There, guards occasionally read aloud from congressional debates, inviting POWs to respond. The prisoners, accustomed to the singular voice of the Führer, were bewildered by the notion that politicians could openly disagree and still remain in power. For the German women, this was more than theory. It reached into the fabric of daily life. Letters from home often described hunger, rationing, and fear of Gestapo surveillance. Yet inside the camp, guards encouraged open speech, even disagreement. It was as if captivity had inverted the very order they once knew freedom behind fences, silence beyond them. This strategy was not without critics. Some officers feared that debate might spark unrest or strengthen loyalty to Nazi ideology, but American planners believed that exposure to democratic practices, even in miniature, would plant seeds for a post-war future, in their eyes. Every conversation was an experiment in re-education not by force, but by contrast. And so, day after day, wooden benches became arenas where the future of ideas was quietly contested. The guards recorded observations. The women carried questions back to their barracks. And slowly, the purpose of these debates became clear. America was fighting not only with tanks and planes, but also with the very concept of freedom of speech. The first sparks of open debate quickly ignited into fire. What began as hesitant exchanges soon turned into battles of conviction, fought not with rifles but with words. The wooden barrack echoed with voices sharp, trembling, insistent as German women prisoners confronted their American guards with arguments sharpened by years of indoctrination. Some of the women were fierce defenders of the Reich. Germany stands united under one leader, one prisoner declared, her voice rising above the rest. Disunity is weakness. That is why your so-called democracy will fail. The words were met not with silence or punishment, but with a calm reply. A young lieutenant leaned forward and countered, "But unity without choice is obedience. Strength comes not from one voice, but from millions who choose to be heard." The clash was electric. The women, unaccustomed to such direct contradiction, reacted with shock. Some shouted louder, others turned inward, folding their arms tightly as if bracing against an unfamiliar wind. It was the collision of two worlds, authoritarian certainty versus democratic chaos, each side convinced of its righteousness. Among the prisoners, a woman named Liesel, once a schoolteacher from Hamburg, stood out. She quoted lines from Nazi speeches she had memorized, insisting that women's duty was loyalty, silence, and sacrifice. An American corporal responded by speaking of his own mother, who not only voted but served as a union organizer in Detroit. "She fights for her rights every day," he said, "and no one tells her to be silent." The room felt tense. The contrast laid bare. The debates grew more heated as days passed. One afternoon, the topic turned to the press. The prisoners argued that German newspapers gave the truth, unclouded by dissent. A guard pulled from his pocket an American paper, its front page filled with opposing editorials about the war. He laid it on the table, inviting the women to read. Confusion flickered across their faces. How could one nation tolerate such contradiction without collapsing? At times, tempers boiled over. A prisoner slammed her fist against the table, tears welling in her eyes. "You are the enemy. How can you expect us to believe your lies?" The guard didn't flinch, because here, even you are allowed to call me a liar and nothing will happen to you. That silence which followed carried more weight than any shouted slogan. These clashes left scars, but also created cracks. The women returned to their barracks exhausted, replaying arguments in their minds. Some scribbled furious notes in diaries, determined to hold the line. Others lay awake, unsettled, wondering why the enemy's words refused to leave them. In those makeshift debating halls, under the watchful eyes of armed guards, the prisoners discovered a strange battlefield. It was not about who would win that day, but about whether truth itself could survive the collision. And for the first time, the unyielding certainty of Nazi ideology faced an opponent it had never anticipated freedom spoken aloud. The arguments had left their mark. What began as fiery resistance soon gave way to uneasy silence in the barracks at night. Beneath the flickering lanterns, whispers replaced slogans, and some of the women, once unwavering in their loyalty, found themselves haunted by questions they had never dared to consider. One evening, a guard read aloud from a pamphlet about freedom of the press in the United States. The words echoed strangely in the wooden room that newspapers could criticize the president, that journalists could publish opposing views without fear of imprisonment. For women who had lived under the shadow of Goebbels' propaganda machine, The idea was unthinkable. Helga, the nurse from Bremen, pressed her diary tightly to her chest, her mind racing. Could it be true that truth itself did not belong to the state, but to the people? The subject of women's suffrage struck even deeper when an American corporal mentioned that his own sister had cast her ballot in the last election. Laughter broke out among the prisoners, sharp, nervous laughter, for them. The notion was absurd. German women had been told their purpose was to serve the home and bear children, not to shape policy. Yet the laughter faded quickly, replaced by silence, as if each prisoner realized the uncomfortable possibility that they had been denied a voice for reasons that were not natural, but imposed. Anna, the secretary from Munich, later confided to a fellow prisoner that she had once dreamed of studying law, but abandoned it under Nazi pressure. Hearing that American women studied freely and entered professions unsettled her. What if, she whispered, our lives could have been different? That fragile admission spread like a ripple, shared from bunk to bunk in hushed tones. Even the structure of democracy itself caused tremors. To hear that multiple parties in Congress could argue, disagree, and still govern without collapsing into chaos seemed almost magical. Too many voices bring disorder, Liesel insisted, clutching her old convictions. But her voice cracked, and the others noticed. The certainty that once filled her words now faltered. These were not grand conversions, not sudden declarations of loyalty to a new cause. They were hesitations, pauses, tiny fractures in a wall built from years of propaganda. The women found themselves questioning not only their enemy, but their own past, their own choices, their own silence. That night, Helga opened her diary and wrote a single sentence that would survive in the camp's confiscated papers. Perhaps it is not weakness to question, perhaps it is strength. The debates had begun as theater, orchestrated by American officers, but in these quiet, trembling moments, their effect became real. Ideology was not shattered in a single blow. It was eroded grain by grain, word by word, until even the most devoted found themselves listening to echoes they could not ignore. If the formal debates were the stage, then the barracks were the backstage where the most revealing dramas unfolded, away from the wooden tables and watchful eyes. The German women whispered, argued, even laughed about the strange new world they were encountering. It was here that the gossip of the camp carried as much weight as the speeches of the guards. Some of the women began secretly writing down the debates in notebooks or on scraps of paper hidden beneath mattresses. Helga's diary, later discovered in confiscated belongings, contained entire dialogues copied word for word, as if she feared that the memory of these conversations might slip away. They say even their leaders are mocked in newspapers. She scribbled one night, "How can authority survive ridicule?" And yet, they seem stronger for it. Not all took the debates with quiet reflection. One afternoon, after an especially heated clash about women's rights, a prisoner named Greta broke down in tears, slamming her fist against her bunk. "They make me doubt things I must not doubt," she cried, her voice cracking. Her fellow prisoners fell silent, recognizing the danger of those words, yet also feeling the same weight pressing down on their hearts. The Americans, too, became part of the gossip. A corporal named Miller was heard joking to a fellow guard after one particularly grueling session. "Debating with these women is harder than any exam I ever took back home." The remark spread through the camp within hours, retold with both pride and humor by the prisoners themselves. To be considered formidable even by the enemy was a small, intoxicating victory. There were lighter moments as well. A group of women once asked to see the newspapers after a debate, only to be baffled by an advertisement showing a black woman smiling in a factory uniform. One prisoner whispered, "Is this a joke?" But when the guard assured them it was real, that black citizens worked side by side with whites in American industry, the barracks buzzed for days. Some scoffed, others marveled, but no one dismissed it entirely. The guards began noticing small shifts. Books and magazines, once ignored, were now requested. When the library cart rolled through the camp, women who had once mocked American culture quietly asked for novels, newspapers, even political pamphlets. One guard reported that a prisoner requested a copy of the U.S. Constitution, claiming she only wanted to see the lies written down. But days later, he found her still reading it, lips moving silently over the words. These side stories, the tears, the jokes, the hidden notes gave the debates life beyond the walls of the meeting room. They turned arguments into memories, into gossip that traveled like sparks through dry grass. And perhaps it was in these unguarded moments, not the formal exchanges, that the greatest shifts began to take root. Tell me, if you had been in that barrack, hearing your comrades whisper doubts by lantern light, would you have joined the discussion or stayed silent to protect yourself? Weeks turned into months, and the ripple effects of the debates became impossible to ignore. What had begun as shock and resistance slowly evolved into curiosity. The German women, once united in defiance, now showed signs of divergence. Some clung tighter to Nazi convictions, their voices sharper with each debate. But others, almost in secret, leaned closer to the guards' words, drawn by the strange gravity of ideas they had been told were poison. The guards themselves noticed the change, where once the women greeted them with icy silence. There were now nods, cautious smiles, even hesitant questions. Anna, the secretary from Munich, surprised one guard when she asked to borrow an English newspaper just to practice the language. Yet later he saw her underlining passages about congressional debates, her brow furrowed in concentration. Helga, who had once doubted aloud, began requesting novels Steinbeck. Hemingway, under the guise of improving her vocabulary, slowly. Suspicion was replaced by engagement. These shifts were not uniform, nor always peaceful. For every prisoner intrigued by American ideals, there was another who grew more defensive. Liesel, the teacher, once scolded her peers for betraying the fatherland with their curiosity. Yet even she was caught reading a borrowed pamphlet by lantern light, whispering excuses when others noticed. The most telling transformation came not in words, but in gestures. Guards recalled how the women began lingering after debates, not rushing back to their barracks, but asking follow-up questions about the Constitution, about voting, even about how Americans handled disagreements without violence. One corporal wrote in his report, "They no longer debate only to resist. They debate to understand." The gossip, too, reflected this shift. A rumor spread that one woman had asked to see the Federalist Papers, though no one could confirm how she even knew the title. Another story told of a prisoner laughing with a guard about American elections, marveling at the absurdity of politicians openly insulting one another on stage. Yet the most profound change was in the prisoners' perception of the guards themselves, where once they had seen faceless enemies. They now saw individuals, young men with stories, families, and struggles of their own. Respect began to grow in unlikely places. One prisoner was overheard telling another, "They fight with words, not fists. Perhaps that is a kind of strength." Still, not everyone welcomed this evolution. A handful of women warned that such curiosity was dangerous, that America's kindness was only camouflage for conquest. But their protests rang less certain than before, their anger betraying an undertone of fear that perhaps the enemy's words were not lies after all. By the winter of 1944, the camp had transformed into something unexpected, not just a place of confinement, but a quiet laboratory of ideas. The barbed wire remained. The war still raged. Yet inside those fences, minds were shifting in ways no one had foreseen. And now I want to ask you, if you had been one of those prisoners, would you have risked your loyalty to question what you had always believed, or would you have held firm, even as doubt crept in? By the spring of 1945, as the Reich crumbled and Allied victory drew near, the women behind the wire knew their days as prisoners were numbered. The camp debates, once a shocking novelty, had become a rhythm of life. But their impact lingered far beyond the wooden tables and guarded doors. When news of Hitler's death reached the camp, the reactions revealed how far things had shifted. Some women wept in genuine grief, clinging to a fading loyalty. Others sat in silence, staring at the dirt floor, as if unable to reconcile the speeches of invincibility with the reality of defeat. A few whispered that perhaps the Americans had been right all along. In their diaries, confiscated later by military censors, traces of transformation appeared. Helga wrote, "If freedom means speaking without fear, then I have tasted it here, not in Germany." Anna noted, "They let us argue, even insult them, and yet tomorrow they greet us the same." This I cannot explain. These were not full conversions, but seeds that would find soil once the women returned home. When repatriation began in late 1946, buses rolled out of camps across America. The women carried little a bundle of clothes, a few letters, Sometimes a book they had managed to keep, but less visible. They carried something more enduring, memories of conversations where the enemy had treated them as thinkers, not tools. For some, those memories would fade under the weight of rebuilding shattered cities. For others, they remained like embers, glowing quietly, ready to spark in post-war Germany's fragile democracy. The Americans, too, reflected on what had unfolded. Guards who once viewed the prisoners as distant adversaries now recalled faces, voices, arguments that lingered long after the war. One corporal admitted to his commander, "I came to guard them with a rifle. I leave knowing I fought them more with words." The symbolic image that endures is simple, yet haunting a wooden table inside a camp, scratched and scarred, where voices once clashed in defiance and curiosity around it. German women and American guards sat as captor and captive, yet for fleeting hours. They were equals in debate, and so the question remains, suspended between history and reflection, were these small, heated conversations mere camp distractions, or were they quiet beginnings of a democratic seed that later took root in a divided, recovering Germany? The story ends not with certainty, but with invitation. Tell me, if history placed you behind that barbed wire, would you have dared to listen, truly listen to your enemy, or would you have guarded your silence? Even as truth knocked at the door, the war ended, but the echoes of those voices did not. In the years that followed, Germany lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered, futures uncertain. Yet within that devastation, something fragile stirred. Among the women who had once sat behind barbed wire, memories of debate returned in unexpected ways, a phrase recalled while reading a newspaper, a guard's quiet explanation remembered when hearing a newscast, the sound of laughter in a barrack that reminded them that dissent need not mean destruction. History often records the thunder of cannons, the sweep of armies, the fall of empires. Less often does it pause for the quiet spaces where human beings confront each other not as enemies, but as voices. Yet perhaps it is in those overlooked corners, a wooden barrack in a Louisiana camp, a notebook filled with stolen words, a whispered question in the dark, that the truest battles are fought and the deepest changes begin. Some of those women went home and resumed lives shaped by hunger, rebuilding, and survival. Others carried with them the unsettling memory that their enemy had allowed them something their own leaders had denied the freedom to speak. That contradiction lingered, like a splinter beneath the skin, refusing to be forgotten, even decades later. Some former prisoners admitted in interviews that they had never again looked at politics the same way. They remembered not just the content of the debates, but the act of debating itself, the strange discovery that disagreement could coexist with respect. That questioning authority did not always end in punishment. That truth was not a single voice but a chorus. And so the image remains a guard lowering his pen, a prisoner raising her hand, and across the gulf of war, two worlds colliding not in silence, but in words.